Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ruby and the Huntsman of Midnight by Susan E., narrated by Caitlin Davies. Chapter 1. The dungeons of Midnight Castle were as bad as Ruby had heard. It was far below the sunshine and flowers of her grandmother's garden, far below the decency of ordinary people. She had never heard of anyone escaping from here. The only light came from the light of the moon. It slipped in between the slats on the ceiling of the corridor that split the rows of cells. The walls were damp, and the air was chilly. The dungeons were overcrowded, and they didn't care who they threw in together. A murderer could be thrown into the same cell with a child. A monster could be thrown in together with a victim of the midnight hunt. It had been years since Ruby had been one of the human prey for the hunt, but she still considered herself one of the victims. That hunt had shaped her as much as her grandmother had. She missed her family the most during the worst of times. She used to always be able to count on her grandmother to comfort and advise her. There had been far too many hard times for Ruby since she'd been taken from her family. And of all the nights she'd had to endure since the midnight hunt, this was likely going to be the worst. Ruby was sure that the man in her cell was a monster. They had thrown both of them in the dungeon on the night of the full moon. The entire castle was tense on the full moon, especially the survivors of the hunt. For them, there were always new surprises on those moonlit nights. Guards had grabbed her out of her cot just after the moon rose and dragged her down the narrow corridors of Midnight Castle. No one ever explained what was about to happen on the full moon. She just had to brace herself for the worst. They tossed her into the dungeon, along with the fresh crop of victims from last month's midnight hunt. Each of them were in their own cells. Like the others, Ruby held on to the bars of her cell to see if she could get a look at what she might have to face this night. The cells were damp from the puddles of rain that had collected beneath the slats in the ceiling. Those openings let the rain and wind in, along with the beams of moonlight spearing the darkness. The dungeons had a particularly eerie feel with the sound of the anxious breathing of the prisoners as they all waited to see their fate. Down the corridor, metal doors clanked, making Ruby clamp her hands tighter around the bars. Footsteps came down the stairs. A lot of them. Were they bringing in another group of prisoners? The group walked through the beams of moonlight, breaking and warping the light as they strode down the corridor. These were no prisoners. These men towered over the guards, at least the ones in the front did. Those were the ones who strutted with their bulging muscles. Some of them were naked. All of them were hairy, with tufts in the oddest places. There was something strange about their lips, as though their mouths had been stuffed with bear traps. The moon lit only strips of them as they passed, so she couldn't get a good look. She could swear something glinted in their mouths, though. Whatever it was, it added to her unease. Behind the first strutting giants, the others were shorter. No, not shorter. Stooped. Some of them were bent almost double, so that their hands grazed the floor as they walked. Their heads jerked back and forth as if they heard noises that startled them. One by one, the guards opened the cell doors, and one of these strange men walked into each cell. Ruby backed away from the corridor. There was nowhere to hide in her small cell, but her instincts had her backing into the shadows anyway. Down the hall, the cell doors squeaked and clanked. Some of the prisoners began to cry in terrified, torn sobs that echoed down the hall. Ruby's cell was one of the last. She squeezed as far from the door as she could, trying to remember to breathe. When her cell door opened, a stooped man walked into the cell without any shoving or threats from the guards. He wasn't chained, despite the fact that he was large and powerfully muscular. He had cuts all over him. What really convinced her that he was a monster, though, was the blood. There was blood all over his face. He had it on his chest and hands, too. Ruby knew a little about the ways that blood could splatter on a person. She'd learned them on her grandmother's lap as a little girl. This was an odd kind of blood pattern. It told her that he had been the attacker and not the victim, but it hadn't been an ordinary fight. An ordinary person would rarely use his mouth to attack. Chapter 2. The hairy beast of a man paid no attention to Ruby. Instead, he curled on the rushes in the center of the cell. He groaned and twitched, sounding as though he was fighting pain or fury, or both. Ruby got as far away from him as she could, huddling in the corner as she watched him. Even her grandmother wouldn't be able to get her out of this. No one had ever escaped the midnight dungeons before. It was infamous for its cruelty. And there were stories. Ruby shut her eyes, willing away the old stories of what happened in the dungeons. She stretched her neck, hearing the crackling and popping as though she was an old woman. She got up timidly, quietly, to move a little. She wanted to stay limber and ready, in case she needed to move quickly. The last thing she needed was to be stiff and clumsy if she had to run or fight. She stretched her legs, loosening her tight muscles. The cell was cold, and it was hard to warm up. All she wanted to do was sit silently as a mouse in the corner and hope he wouldn't notice her in the shadows. But hope could be a dangerous thing if it didn't come hand in hand with caution. The man's breathing changed. He stopped twitching. Ruby had the feeling that he was watching her through his lashes. A spike of panic washed over her. She was trapped in here with this man who had blood on his hands and face. His nails were tattered and clogged with something that looked like torn flesh. This was only her first night in the dungeons, and she wasn't sure that she'd survive the night. "I can defend myself," Ruby imitated her grandmother's voice, strong and full of confidence. "You'd be better off finding easier prey." Of course, there was no easier prey than a girl trapped in a cell with a monster. A low growl came from the man, a deep rumbling that was more animal than human. Ruby forced herself away from the corner. The cell was small, but she was better off having space to maneuver. In the corner, she'd have nowhere to retreat to. The man began twitching again on the floor, the way a dog might twitch while dreaming. But he was awake, wasn't he? Down the hall, someone screamed. At the same time, there was a ferocious sound that was part growl and part animal screech. Another scream. This time, the sound was closer. After that, the screams came in a wave down the corridor, as if whatever was happening was catching like fire from one cell to the next. The man in Ruby's cell twitched and jerked. His face contorted, and his nose wrinkled. Then he screamed, too. The sound was full of agony and violence. The boy who was in the cell across the way grabbed the bars of his cell and screamed. He was no older than Ruby. Old enough to be considered a man, but young enough to sometimes be called a boy. He looked terrified and frantically tried to squeeze his way through the bars. In the dark shadows behind him, hairy hands reached out and grabbed him. His screams intensified, his eyes begging her for help. The hands dragged him back into the dark recesses of his cell. All through the dungeon row, the air filled with screams and growls. The scariest sounds, though, were the screams that suddenly stopped midway, or the screams that ended in a gurgle. Despite Gran's old warnings about not backing herself into a corner, Ruby backed all the way against the wall. The man in her cell jerked his head up. He led with his nose instead of his eyes, as if he was blind. But he clearly wasn't blind, because his eyes seemed to have an eerie yellowish glow as they watched her. He dragged his weirdly long limbs as he pushed himself off the floor. Had they been that long before? Despite his strange proportions, he moved gracefully, without wasting a single motion, like an animal, like a predator. Ruby heard herself pant. Her heart pounded in her ears, roaring panic raging through her. Then the man, who was perhaps not entirely a man, curled his lips to show his unusually sharp teeth. Before she could get out a scream, he leapt onto her. Chapter 3. Tyler hated the stench of the dungeons. His grandfather would roll in his grave if he knew what the great Huntsman line had to do in order to keep their positions at Midnight Castle. They were hunters serving the royal family, not jailers. But these days, everyone who served the crown seemed to be a jailer. He tried to ignore the stench and walked down the dingy corridor. The morning sun had finally come up and was streaming weakly through the slats in the ceiling. He never came here in the dark. His superstitious resistance to come at night was probably a sign of his ancestors' low birth. but he didn't care. There was more to the world than what he could see and hear, and he was not foolish enough to ignore his instincts. The night was getting longer, though, and each day got shorter. Soon, the sun would disappear altogether, according to the kitchen maids. He walked down the corridor that split the rows of cells and looked into the carnage in each one. It wasn't that he wasn't used to seeing wild animals kill and feed. It was what they were feeding on that turned his stomach. He tried to ignore the blood and bones, the gristle and head, the hair and fingers that were strewn about in the cells. He tried not to think about the angelic girl he'd caught a glimpse of before she was thrown into one of those cells. With large eyes and flame-colored hair, she had been the picture of vulnerability and fright. Tyler had hardened himself to this job 2 years ago, when his father couldn't do the task anymore. He had to take over the job if he didn't want to anger the Dark King. Just being noticed by the king could be fatal, not just to the person catching the king's attention, but to his entire family. As Tyler walked down the corridor, he occasionally stopped and pointed into a cell when he saw a specimen that he thought was ready. It took months for these beasts to fully transform. In theory. So far, they'd all failed, ending up with a yard full of what Tyler and his men called the howlers. When Tyler pointed, his men went into the cell to carefully drag out the beast. It was a dangerous thing, this luring of monsters out of their den. It took 6 men for each one. A man with a net to throw over the beast, 2 with long sticks with a noose at the end to tighten around its arms and neck, and 2 with barbed spears to coax it out of the dungeon. They used to put the beasts directly into a cage, but then Tyler's men had to carry them up the stairs. That proved almost impossible to do with the monster thrashing about, tearing at the men. They'd only take the strongest of the litter, which made the whole ordeal even worse. Tyler had been grateful he only had to do this horrible task 2 or 3 times a year. Lately, though, the Dark King had been going through his pets as though they were disposable game. "Let's get this over with, lads. Then I'll buy you all a drink at the tavern tonight." He'd seen the offer of a drink brighten up the boys in the past, but this was not a task that anyone would do if they had the choice, drink or not. Nor were they excited to have a drink with Tyler. Although he still tried to maintain camaraderie with his men, he knew that he was no longer one of them. That was what happened when he went from the group's errand boy to their master. Tyler picked out 3 beasts out of the dungeons. There were 2 more cells at the end of the row, but he only needed 3. Any more and they'd be too hard to handle. He was inclined to leave the last 2 cells without even looking at them. He was in no rush to add to the horror he'd already seen this morning. But his men were busy taking the last monster up the stairs, and Tyler couldn't get past them anyway. So if he was stuck in the dungeons for a little while longer, he might as well inspect the last 2 creatures and see how they were faring. In the past, that would have been a pleasure for any of the animals he had been responsible for. He'd always had a deep connection with the animals under his care. But the days of keeping stag and hare for the hunts were long gone. All he had left was this. Tyler steeled himself for the carnage in the last 2 cells. He'd about reached his limit. The one to his right was like all the others. He tried to ignore the bloody mess and studied the beast coiled in the corner. Did Tyler recognize the monster? He turned away quickly in case it was someone he'd seen before. It was hard to tell with all the excess hair. Even their bone structure changed as the beast in them got stronger. Nevertheless, he occasionally recognized someone. There was that baker 6 months ago who used to sell him potato cakes, and the milkmaid who had actually been sweet on him for a week or 2. Tyler shook his head to get rid of the memories. This was a dark enough day as it was. He didn't need to invite more stains on his soul. There was once a time when he was known as a friendly sort, but those days were long gone. These days, he didn't even want to look at a person's face unless they were part of his staff. He'd made them all a promise that if they turned into a beast, he'd end it for them quickly and not let it get this far. There would be no dungeons and chains for his men. Only the last cell remained for him to look at. Unless this monster looked stronger and more aggressive than even the ones he'd already selected, Tyler would be done for the day. What he saw there stopped his breath. At first, he thought he'd lost his senses. He blinked, unable to take in what he was seeing. It took a moment, but eventually, he began to breathe again. His heart kept racing, though. A slip of a girl sat in the cell. The most noticeable thing about her was her deeply red hair. He couldn't tell if that was her natural color, or if it was all the blood. Unlike the other beasts, she'd squeezed herself into the corner as far away from her kill as she could. Her face, hands, and ankles had no fur growing out of them, and that confused him. All the newborn howlers had fur growing on them by this point in their development. She looked at him with dread in her eyes. She knew that he had power over her in the same way that a trapped rabbit knew. Tyler frowned, arguing with his instincts. She couldn't be human. That wasn't possible. The castle guards fed the transforming monsters small prey like her. The king's sorcerers were obsessed with the idea that the beasts would complete a successful transformation if they ate a human sacrifice early in their development. It didn't matter that they hadn't had a single success yet. All they had were a yard full of howlers, neither men nor wolfkin. Tyler took little comfort in the fact that the command had come directly from the Dark King. The king had instructed all of them personally in every detail of how the monsters should be raised and trained. It killed Tyler a little each time when it was time to collect the new beasts from the dungeon for the king's menagerie. It had happened enough now that he was dead inside many times over. There had been some relief in that. A dead man had no heart to stir, no tears to pool, no loss of sleep over the death of so many of the kingdom's helpless citizens. But now, the heart that Tyler was so sure he no longer had was calling for attention. It skipped beats, then raced at what he was seeing. This was no beast looking back at him from the other side of the bars. On the far side of the cell, the creature that should have torn her to pieces and eaten her was lying unmoving in the rushes. It hadn't been an easy death for him. His head lay at an unnatural angle, as did his elbow and knee. One of his eyes was gouged out and hanging on his cheek. Tyler looked back at the traumatized girl cringing in the corner of the cell. On closer inspection, she wasn't a child, although she gave the impression of one. She wasn't quite a full-grown woman yet either, but she was thin and looked as weak as a piece of cloth. "Did you kill him?" His question was genuine. There had been no one else in the cell, but it was hard to fathom that this girl had fought off a monster. Of course, this hadn't been a true monster like the wolfkin. They were mere imitations, conjured up by the king's sorcerers, and only a few days old at that. Most of them wouldn't even survive the upcoming weeks, and so far, all of them had gotten stuck as a twisted howler that was not quite man, yet not quite wolfkin either. Nevertheless, a howler was still a killer. They weren't as strong as wolfkin, but some might argue that they were just as savage. They were all instinct with no control, confused and dangerously insane for months to come. He expected the girl to simper and cower, to not have enough courage to answer him. She seemed all eyes and vulnerability as she trembled there like a piece of fluff in the corner. But she did answer him, and with a voice that didn't have the slightest tremor. "Yes, I killed him." Chapter 4. Ruby hardly knew what was happening, and didn't much care. She'd thought that the night she was captured had been the worst of her life, but last night had far exceeded it. She felt numb as the jailer opened her cell door and motioned for her to step out. A part of her noticed that he was not dressed in the uniform of the others who had thrown her in here. He was dressed in suede and hard leather and carried a bow across his back, as if he was going out for a hunt. Grand's lessons were so ingrained in her that she automatically noted the knives he carried, two at his waist, one in his boot. She had to assume that a man with this many weapons carried more that she couldn't see. Could she get one away from him? He didn't seem particularly cautious, but he kept a close eye on her as she walked by him. He was much bigger than her, and she was so exhausted that she could barely stand. Whatever he wanted with her, she couldn't stop him. "How did you do it?" asked the hunter. "He attacked me." Her lips were so dry that she could barely get the words out. "How did you kill him?" He pointed to the stairs at the far side of the dungeon. That was the way out. Would they send her back out into the hunt for sport? Would they hang her in public for defending herself against whatever it was that they'd thrown into her cell? My grandmother taught me to fight. She shuffled down the aisle. Ruby had been dreaming of her grandmother lately. It was strange, yet comforting. In her dreams, Ruby continued her training with Gran, learning new moves and tactics that were useful in her real life. Of course, they must have been lessons that Gran had given her already that she was remembering through dreams, but they were remarkably useful. Ah, your grandmother was in the war. Ruby nodded, staring at the cells as they walked by. She almost stumbled when she saw the carnage inside the cells. Most of it was in the shadows, but she caught enough of the blood and gore to understand what had happened there. To understand that she was supposed to meet that same fate. It turned her stomach, but she'd already thrown up everything in it, so all it could do was heave. She backed away from one cell, only to realize that she was getting too close to another. "Are you frightened?" He sounded genuinely curious. She looked sharply at him. "Why bother to torture? Why not just kill us outright and leave us some dignity?" "Dignity?" He looked surprised. "The Dark King does not tolerate dignity in his kingdom. Don't you know that by now?" Was that an insult to the king? If so, that bordered on treason. But Ruby was just a country girl, not schooled in the ways of the court. Her grandmother had told her to never trust anyone from the castle. Gran worked with nobles all the time, and she was careful not to let Ruby weave fanciful notions around them. Romantic notions would get a girl killed, she'd always said. Ruby wanted to be strong, needed to be strong to survive this. The problem was that she wasn't all that strong. She was thirsty and hungry, and her legs trembled so much that she couldn't believe she'd walked this far. Her hands shook too. Her mind kept screaming about the events that happened last night. How she was sure she would die. How she knew that unless she did horrible things to survive, those same horrible things would be done to her. Ruby stumbled. The hunter jerked forward as if to catch her, but then he stopped and let her fall or not as she would. It was a curious motion, as if he hadn't quite made up his mind about what kind of a person he was. She managed to stay on her feet. She kept her eyes straight ahead so that she wouldn't see the horror show in the cells on either side of her. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, though, the last of her strength ran out. The stairs seemed to go up forever. At the top, there was a sliver of light. It was sunshine. She was sure of it. Just the thought of feeling the warmth of the sun renewed her strength. She thought she'd never see it again. She managed a few steps, but each step became harder to climb. "I will not catch you if you fall," said the hunter. She didn't say anything to that. Her grandmother would have made a sharp retort, but Ruby wasn't her grandmother. She just climbed the next step. She kept expecting the hunter to shove her up the stairs, but he waited and let her go at her pace. Then she stumbled and fell to her knees. The pain was sharp and shot all the way up to her head. She tried to get up, knowing that they would either kick her down the steps and watch her tumble or, if she was lucky, drag her up by her hair. But she was more exhausted than she'd ever been. She'd fought all night to stay alive, and that had taken more than she had. She couldn't get up. Ruby would have cried then if not for the training of her grandmother. As a child, she'd rarely gotten any attention for crying. Gran had no time for silly things like that, so it had been trained out of Ruby at a young age. The hunter called over his men. They looked like workers, while the hunter looked like a lord compared to them. "Take her up and put her in a cage. Don't hurt her." He looked down at her with cautious eyes. "But don't let her looks fool you. Give her an opening, and she'll tear you to pieces like any of the other predators." Chapter 5. The girl wasn't a monster. Tyler wasn't sure what she was, but she wasn't a howler. He'd seen the whole lifespan of a howler, from the ways they could be born to the ways they could die, and this was no howler or wolfkin that he'd ever seen. From what he could tell, she was just an exhausted young woman barely out of her girlhood. If he'd seen her out on the street, he would have dismissed her as weak and ordinary, maybe even timid. She didn't resist when his men threw a net over her and cinched their ropes around her neck and body. "Don't hurt her!" His voice came out with as much command as the Dark King's. "She's fragile." He stopped himself from saying that she was precious. He almost laughed at himself over the impulse. Nothing in midnight could become precious to a person, not if he wanted to live. That kind of weakness became a death sentence or a life of slavery as soon as someone found out about it, especially if that someone was from the court. Tyler already had his father, and far too many knew about that weakness. Of course, he only meant that she was precious in the same way as a prized animal was precious. Better not to ever say the word in the first place, though, just in case someone misinterpreted his meaning. His men could tell that he thought of her as special anyway. They must have known themselves that this girl was different. They'd pulled up plenty of predators from the dungeon, and none were anything like her. More than a few crossed themselves in the manner of the old religion when they saw her. It took some courage to do it in the open, considering that the Dark King and most of midnight was far from any religion. But they were men who handled the worst of the Dark King's creatures. Most people would forgive them for small trespasses like this, simply because they knew that no one would have taken this job unless they had no other choice. They carefully and awkwardly picked up the girl and walked her up the stairs. They held their spears at the ready while carrying her by her shoulder and feet. She was wrapped in the net and ropes, and she seemed to be almost relieved to be off her feet. He didn't like the way she slumped. She didn't even struggle. Her eyes were still open, but it looked like she was fighting to keep them that way. Tyler could feel the threat of disappointment hanging over him. He had been so careful to manage his expectations that it was almost a surprise to feel it. It had been a long time since he'd had this level of interest. He wanted to see what she was, what she could do, to see if she was an ordinary human or perhaps something more special. There must have been plenty of other types of night creatures in the world that people didn't know about other than wolfkin, wraith horses, wild fairies, trolls, and such. Perhaps she was something like that. Could a mere girl kill a wolfkin-like creature made from dark magic? Possible, but it would take someone skilled, and even then, it would take luck and a tight dungeon cell. He could only find out if he kept her alive. His men placed her in a cage and secured it with a heavy lock. The cage was his own creation, a cage with an intricate latch that an animal couldn't open. It was also built into a wagon, so that his men wouldn't have to lift the animals. There was a ramp that they could use to guide the animals and shut them in without injury. Tyler had been proud of the design when he came up with it as a child, showing it to his father. His father had burst with pride as he looked at it, never knowing that it would one day be used to hold monsters. Each of the men climbed onto their wagons and drove their horses. Ordinary horses would die of fright if they were tied too long near a wolfkin. They often recognized wolfkin by smell, even if he was in human form. Howlers seemed to fall into that category, even though they were neither wolfkin nor human. Wraith horses, on the other hand, could take on a wolfkin in a fight, and often win. Tyler didn't know if they were natural enemies, or if the unnatural situation of being enslaved had them all at each other's throats. He supposed he'd never know. He wished he could take the wraith horses on hunts with him. It wasn't the flaming mane and tail that was the problem. The forest hardly ever caught on fire, and when it did, it never grew large. The forest took care of itself. The problem was the wolfkin. Regardless of which direction the wind was blowing, wolfkin seemed to sense wraith horses. He might as well wear bells all over himself and yell into the woods that he was hunting. To keep the wraith horses from kicking the metal cages into bits, they only used horses that were exhausted. It was such a waste of the magnificent creatures to have them pull a wagon, but they were the only ones who could do it. The only other option was to use the king's slaves, and Tyler wouldn't do that unless ordered to. 2 of the wraith horses were little more than sagging hide over bones. The hide was torn and flapping in places, showing the bone and sinew beneath it. Their manes and tails burned bright, though. The horse pulling the girl's cage was muscular and burned the brightest. The flames were crimson and yellow, dancing along the horse's neck and swinging along.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?